Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Angie Furman, and I'm the River Training Center Coordinator for River Management Society. And today's session is part of our Wild and Scenic River Training Series. This is a 6-part series that we're doing with once a month webinars. And today we are going to be looking at protective management for eligible and suitable wild and scenic river segments. So very happy you are all here today. Just a couple notes before we get started. We are recording and I will be sending this out via email afterwards. Probably in about 24 hours, that email will go out. You can also find the recording from this session as well as any of our previous sessions on the RMS YouTube channel. I'll put a link to that here in a minute in the chat. We do have live transcript available. And really, we're hoping to, have some good dialogue today. We're going to be going through some slides and we're going to be going through a bunch of scenarios and really hoping to hear from all of you. Because nothing that we're presenting is super cut and dry, right? It's going to be dependent on a lot of different things, the answers to the prompts. So really encouraging you to interact, engage, and there's a couple ways you can do that. We do have the chat box where you can type in your questions as we're going. That way you don't forget them. We will have some time for us to hear from you, whether questions and answers or your opinions about the different scenarios that we're going through. So you're also welcome to raise your hand and then unmute when we call on you. So in the meantime, we'd love to know who's joining us. If you can introduce yourself in the chat box, your name, where you're at, that would be great. And I'm going to ask our presenters today, Kai Allen and Tanji Akasi-Otu, to introduce themselves. So Kai, why don't you introduce yourself first?
Thanks, Angie. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Glad you're here. My name is Kai Allen. I work for the Bureau of Land Management in Southwestern Oregon on the Rogue National Wild and Scenic River. And I also represent BLM on the Interagency Wild and Scenic Rivers Coordinating Council. Worked for the Forest Service and BLM and National Park Service for quite a few years in rivers. And so have a lot of background and experience. Glad to be here.
Thanks, Kai. Tanji.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tanji Akasi-Otu. I'm coming to you from Northern Virginia. I work with the Forest Service with the Washington office team. I'm a wilderness and wild and scenic rivers program specialist. I also work with Kai on the Interagency Wild and Scenic Rivers Coordinating Council. So we're doing a little bit of that interagency exchange and perspective today on this topic. And yeah, just wanted to say thanks so much everyone for being here. We were all just talking about how important of a topic this is and really looking to teach not necessarily right answers, but the right questions to ask to arrive at answers that really are compatible with the intent of eligibility, suitability, Wild and Scenic Rivers Act in general. So thanks for being here and please ask questions if you have them.
Thanks, Tanji. And yes, I see that we've got a whole bunch of people joining us today with various levels of experience. So hoping to hear from some of you as well. So feel free to speak up and add things if you have anything to add. Today, we're going to be just really going through like the what, the why, and the how of protective management. Like I mentioned earlier, we've got several scenarios to go through and kind of get us thinking, again, about what questions to ask. We'll cover a little bit about NEPA process for proposed actions, and then we'll have some time for question and answer. So that being said, I am going to pass it over to Kai to get us started.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Angie. And I just wanted to come back to one of the things that Angie mentioned in her introduction, and that is to emphasize that this material can be pretty complicated. Sometimes it lives in gray areas of policy. And I just always encourage everyone to, reach out to your agency specialists, consult your manuals, consult policy. I get stumped regularly doing this work as well, even after, a lot of years of working in it as my career. So let's just kind of keep that in mind. And I'm always learning myself. So we'll keep this as kind of an open forum for both questions. And I know there's a lot of experienced folks on here as well. And we'd love to hear from you. So starting off, what do we mean by protective management? What is it and why is it important? So the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, but also agency policy, requires the federal agencies to protect study rivers. Those are eligible and suitable rivers, to protect them from adverse effects to their outstandingly remarkable values, water quality, free-flowing condition, and their tentative classification, so their wild, scenic, or recreational status. And the ultimate purpose of protective management of study rivers is to keep the options open for Congress as we debate as a society whether or not these places should be included in the national system of wild and scenic rivers. Okay, next slide. So just a little bit of a review of the act itself and the background for wild and scenic river studies. So recall that Section 4 of the Wild and Scenic River Act describes how Section 5A studies, those are congressionally authorized studies, will be conducted. And then Section 5 of the Act, it includes the list of congressionally authorized study rivers, but it also describes how federal agencies, all federal agencies, will consider potential wild and scenic river designation during the river basin planning and project level planning. And this essentially represents the framework of what we know as eligible and suitable rivers. Okay, next slide. So Section 4, let's take a step back here. So there are two different kinds of study rivers that you might encounter out there. The first are the Section 5A congressionally authorized rivers. So remember that Section 4 of the Act directs the federal agencies to study those specific rivers that have been authorized by Congress. And we refer to these as the congressionally authorized study rivers. Next slide. So when Congress authorizes a study, the protective management for that river during the study period is a little bit different than it would be for an agency study under Section 5D1 of the Act. So congressionally authorized rivers, their protection actually sources directly from the Act. And both during the study and for a period of time after the study is completed, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act protections actually apply to those rivers. So for example, Section 7B of the Act, that's Section 7 that restricts the FERC from licensing projects on study rivers. And it requires a higher level review of other projects, so water resources projects. Section 8B withdraws public lands from entry, sale, or other disposition under the mining laws, which is in Section 9. And so back to Section 8. So those study rivers are withdrawn from disposal, entry, disposal under the public land laws. Section 9 deals with mining, hard rock mining. And then Section 12 also applies to study rivers, where all federal agencies are required to ensure that protection of river values on their lands inside, adjacent, or bordering the river during the study period, that their actions don't have adverse effects to the qualities of the river during the study. Next slide. So for 5A study rivers, the protection period lasts through the study process and then for 3 years following transmittal of the study to Congress. And most likely you will know if you have a congressionally authorized study river on your unit or in your region, whatever area you're working in. And it's really important, I think, with congressionally authorized study rivers to consult with your wild and scenic river specialists in your agency and review your policy. Things can get pretty complicated during a study on a congressionally authorized 5A river. Next slide. So the second kind of study river that we work with, probably the one that you're going to interact with more commonly in your work, are the Section 5D1 rivers. So Section 5D1 requires all federal agencies to consider the potential for wild and scenic river designation during their river basin planning and during any project plans that may eventually end up in the hands of Congress. So wild and scenic river potential must be considered. And then the 4 federal wild and scenic river administering agencies are required to complete studies and investigations of potential wild and scenic river designation on our own lands. And so again, these are the eligible and suitable rivers. Next slide. So for Section 5D1 rivers, it's important to make the distinction that the protective management that we apply to those rivers sources from existing agency policy. There's nothing in the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act that directly requires protective management. It is an administrative choice that we make during planning and project review. And so we apply our existing land management authorities like the FLTMA, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, Archaeological Resource Protection Act, and others to protect those river values, free-flowing condition, classification, and water quality. Next slide. So we're going to jump into a number of case studies and examples. And so for example, we're going to run through these. We're going to focus on the outcomes of a project. So as you're doing an analysis for protective management on potential projects on a wild and scenic river, you want to think about what the outcome is going to be on the landscape and for people who visit and use the place. So in this particular example, the first one that we're going to start in with, you may ask yourself, would developing additional recreation sites influence the quality of a potential recreational ORV on this river? So for example, next slide. Or in this example, could developing existing access roads or building a new road to access the bank of the river, could that change the classification of the segment? So if for example, is a wild segment of river and there's a proposal to construct a road, how would that affect or change the classification of the segment? Next slide. And lastly, I want to touch on special situations in protective management. So there are times and rivers where Congress has applied special protective management provisions to rivers that have either not been designated yet or perhaps even studied. So this is a picture of the Lower Salmon River and in Idaho. It is not a designated river, but Congress, through legislation, put some special protections in place for this stretch of the river related to mineral development and mining, and also Section 7 applies to the Lower Salmon River. Similarly, the Rogue River where I manage, Congress added some special protections to a number of the tributaries, which are not designated wild and scenic rivers, but they have Section 7-like protections. And so it's important to be sure when you're working on one of these projects to check whether or not you have any legislative or other special requirements that may apply. Okay, so we're gonna transition into doing some scenarios here, and this is where we put our thinking caps on and drop your answers in the chat. Feel free to come on with your camera and ask questions if you have any clarifying questions about the scenario. Let's keep it free and open, and I'll help each other work through these. Okay, so as we go through these, I'm going to read off a description of the river segment, including its ORVs and its classification of the study river. I'll read through the proposed action of what's being proposed on the river, and then I'll sort of pose some critical questions that you want to think about as you're coming up with your solution as we work through it. Next slide. Okay, so this is the first scenario, and it relates to developing recreation on a suitable river. The example in this case study is the Dolores River in western Colorado. Some of you may be familiar with that river, incredible place. So the ORVs in this example for the Dolores River are recreation, which includes float boating, geology, and rare riparian plant species. The tentative classification is recreational at the put-in here that you see in the picture. And then just downstream, it turns into a wild classified segment where it flows through a wilderness study area managed by BLM. And the eligibility report for this river noted that the water quality can sometimes be impaired by excessive bank erosion. So these are inputs into our case study. Okay, next slide. The agency proposed action is up here, and we are proposing to replace an informal, undeveloped boat launch with a concrete boat ramp, developed parking area, and toilet facilities. We're also going to install a kiosk that posts the user regulations, hosts a self-permit station, and has a number of interpretive displays. So that's the agency proposed action. Next slide. And here's some key questions that we might want to ask about this proposal on this suitable segment of river. How would the new facilities influence visitor use and visitor experiences? Remember, recreation is an ORV. Would the new facilities have indirect effects, including also or direct effects on river values beyond the construction site? Would the construction of the boat ramp affect the free-flowing condition, and how would you address this in your analysis? So what do we think? Should we approve or deny this project? Any ideas or any questions about the inputs?
You're welcome to put those in your response in the chat, or you can raise your hand, come off mute. I see a question in the chat asks, how far into the river does the new facility go?
Yeah, that's a great question to ask for sure, right? Yeah, so how far into the channel is the river? Yep, or is the boat ramp? Let's just say it extends 10 feet.
I also see in the chat, Monica says, the new facilities could enhance the recreational value. It may invite more use.
Yeah, great answer. Yep. Anyone else?
Then I saw Lisa just added in the chat, consider whether development is consistent with the classification. In this case, developed recreation facilities are consistent with the definition of the recreational classification. And I see Galen also added into the chat, approve. The hardened boat launch may reduce stream bank erosion and should not affect the recreational classification at the launch site.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so I think it's probably some folks picked up on that. Thank you, Monica, that it's not likely to affect the riparian or the geology ORVs. It's kind of located in an area that's already disturbed. And would probably actually enhance the recreation ORV by making river access easier and probably a little bit safer for everyone, a little bit more orderly. Potentially in your analysis, you might note that the recreational ORV might also be negatively affected if the access point induces more people to come visit the river or causes a crowding situation downstream, particularly in the wild section, which is down below. And probably a project like this would help the water quality. Remember that the eligibility study noted that bank erosion was causing water quality issues. These would all be things that you'd want to discuss in your NEPA analysis for the project. Great. Any other thoughts? So there's a really good, thanks, Alan. I saw your question here in the chat, and you talk about section 7. So what do we think? Would we need to do a section 7 determination for this project? Any thoughts? Monica asks whether or not it's a congressional study river. Yeah, that's a really important distinction. Is it a 5D1 study river or is it a congressional study river? And just to follow up on that, yeah, if it was a congressional study river, you would be required to do section 7 during the period of the study for this project. But typically for 5D1 agency identified rivers, a section 7 determination isn't required, but you probably would want to do, something to assess your effects to the free flowing conditions. So some kind of a free flow analysis or something like that in your NEPA for the approval of this project. Yeah, great. Let's go on to the next one, Angie. Okay, this one is a transportation scenario. Slate River in Colorado, which I believe has been studied. I think the picture says to be studied, but it has been studied in reality. But for the scenario, let's just say that it hasn't been studied yet. The ORVs are scenic, historic, and recreation, with a tentative classification of recreational. Next slide. The agency proposed action is to construct a bridge for OHVs, horses, bikers, so a multi-use trail bridge crossing. And part of the mitigation for the project is we're going to reduce the visual effects by building the crossing, the bridge, in a forested part of the river rather than out in the open. So some key questions for this project that you might ask would be, could the bridge have adverse effects to the ORVs? Or could it alter the potential classification of this river or the free flowing conditions? What do we think? Any ideas? Okay, yeah, so thanks, Ashley. Yeah, Ashley mentioned that there could be some effects to scenery, the scenery ORV. Any other thoughts? How would you approach this in NEPA? What kind of questions would you ask in your NEPA, and what kind of things would you want to make sure that you analyze for in your NEPA document, the approval document? Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks, Monica. Yep. Monica writes in the chat that the bridge should completely span the river to try to mitigate impacting free-flowing conditions, say having to construct abutments or piers within the channel of the river. Yeah, great. All great ideas in the comments there. Yeah, so you want to look at how the ORVs are described. So exactly what is the ORV to the extent that you can find that. Considering Clean Water effects, Clean Water Act effects, engaging with your other specialists, right? So your fisheries biologist or your hydrologist might be able to help you with that analysis. Alan mentions looking at alternative crossing locations. So maybe there's a different place for the bridge that may reduce effects or impacts to ORVs or free-flowing condition. Great, thinking about visitor use management. Thanks, Becky. Yeah, that's a great comment. Yeah, so how is this going to affect visitors? How will it affect, kind of our experience of this place or boating, for example? Like a bridge over a river can have effects to boating, or could affect free-flowing conditions if the bridge wasn't built tall enough to consider flood impacts. Yeah, great. Did anybody pick up on that? It's a multi-use trail, right? So it's going to be designed for, and the trail leading to the bridge is designed for multiple different kinds of uses, including OHVs. So that might be a consideration as you're thinking about kind of recreation management. Okay, great. Any other closing thoughts on that one? Okay, next slide. Okay, this is another visitor use management scenario here where we've got a section of the Colorado River in Utah. It has been found suitable. The ORVs for this section river are scenery recreation, which includes float boating, archaeology, and endangered fish, with a tentative classification of wild. And the proposal for this example is to harden an existing campsite. The agency, because of impacts to the campsite, is proposing to install some permanent fire rings and some picnic tables. So what are some of the key questions that you might ask in your analysis for this project? Is it consistent with the classification? How could the proposal affect visitor experiences and the kind of that wild character of the river? What about the ORVs? Anything about this proposal that could have adverse impacts to the ORVs? What do you think? Yeah,
Yes.
archaeology for sure, especially in the desert Southwest along the river, like the Colorado and many of the rivers in the desert Southwest. Archaeology is a major deal. What do you think about classification? So it's in a wild section of river. Should this, would you want to discuss the effects to classification and whether or not it's consistent? Yeah, thanks, Ashley. Yeah, in a wild section, you'd want to try to design it so it's at least out of view of the river. What about the structures themselves? Do you think that's compatible with a wild classified section of river? Yeah, thanks, Galen. Yeah, Galen mentions that he thinks that fire rings and picnic tables wouldn't be consistent with the wild river classification. Yeah, and I completely agree with that, Galen. I think under wild river classification, this wouldn't be the kind of development that you would want to consider or approve in your NEPA process. Maybe there are alternatives, right? To needing to harden a campsite to this degree that you want to put in fire rings and picnic tables. Right. Yeah, so you want to think about alternative ways to solve the problem if you can. And a lot of times there are other ways, maybe through regulations or developing additional primitive campsites to kind of disperse use. There are a whole plethora of different things you can do to manage recreation impacts than hardening a site, particularly in a wild classified section of river. Great. Yeah, any other closing thoughts on that one? Okay, let's go on to the next one. Oh, this one can get complicated really fast. So we're talking about an example that deals with rights of way in Wild and Scenic River. So this segment of river in the picture for our example, the ORVs are scenic and recreation and cultural, and also fish. The tentative classification through the study is scenic, and this river is eligible. The agency proposed action is to construct a critical interstate power line through the river corridor, across the river there. And the crossing location is somewhat flexible. Remember that scenery is an ORV. Okay, next slide. So here's a few key questions that you might ask in your analysis. What are the key characteristics of the scenery ORV? Right, so like you'd want to know how the ORV was described in the study or in your resource management plan, your land and resource management plan. Is the ORV actually attributed to only certain locations within the corridor? So for example, this canyon right here may be what is described as the scenery ORV, but there's another crossing location perhaps somewhere where scenery wouldn't be as affected. What's the character and extent of the existing development in the river corridor? It's a good question to ask. So what do you think? Would we approve it or deny it? Pull up the chat here. So I see Alan asks whether all these examples are congressionally studied rivers or NRI rivers or Section 5D1 rivers. Yeah, and these are all 5D1 rivers, but that's a great question that you would definitely want to ask. What kind of study river is it? Including whether or not it's on the nationwide rivers inventory. We can come back to that later, maybe. Monica weighs in and says, yeah, with mitigation, you might be able to approve it. Possibly, depends on how much latitude you have to move it. What you could do to reduce the contrast of the development as seen from the river. And that's really important, is to identify like how the scenery ORV is constructed, like what exactly constitutes the scenery ORV, and what would be the level of effects that this project might have to the scenery ORV. This project would probably have effects to scenery, and they could be long-term and potentially serious effects, almost regardless of where you put a high transmission corridor power line across a river like this. Probably also would affect classification, right? Depending on what's there before the power line went in. High voltage transmission lines usually require roads and infrastructure and maintenance and visibility, balloons on the lines where they cross the river for air traffic, things like that are things you'd want to think about in terms of effects to scenery. What else? Any other thoughts there? What do you think about the fact that it's eligible? So this is an eligible river, hasn't been studied yet for suitability. Do you think the project like this might also require the agency to conduct a suitability determination in its NEPA? Any thoughts on that? I mean, potentially we could be foreclosing on an ORV, possibly if you couldn't mitigate it. Most all the agencies, at least for BLM, and I think Forest Service as well, looks to discourage these kinds of projects from study rivers, from eligible, suitable rivers. Suitable for sure, and definitely with eligible. And Becky brings up a good observation that you could try to, another thing you'd want to do is try to see if there are existing other rights of way where these things can be located. And that actually is agency policy, is to kind of discourage these sorts of projects, look to see if it can be combined within an existing right-of-way that already exists, rather than constructing a new right-of-way across a river like this. Yeah, thanks, Kyle. Yeah, I agree. I think you would probably, on a project like this, you probably would need to address suitability in the NEPA. It really just depends on, I think, on the effects that could occur from the project. But if it's eligible, you may need to consider doing suitability within the NEPA analysis for the project. Great. Yeah, that's a tricky one. And it's a great example, I think, of how interdisciplinary this work can be, right? So you'd be working really closely with your lands and realty specialist, probably a landscape architect, probably a number of contractors, both from the proponent, but also possibly contractors doing some special studies to help the agency get through the analysis on this one. Rights of way can be pretty complicated. You're dealing potentially with valid existing rights, and that's a question you would want to ask: is this an existing right of way that's already been approved but perhaps not constructed? Yeah, Brian, that's a really good question. Potentially, yeah, you might address suitability within your project NEPA, and then you may need to do a amendment to your land and resources management plan. That could be a possibility. if it is not already found suitable, and the project would have or could have long-term adverse effects to the ORV, you may decide that you need to do a suitability determination, which potentially and also the forest plan amendment or resource management plan amendment. Great. Yeah, these are really complicated. So thanks everybody for the input on that one. Let's go to the next one, Angie. Okay, another visitor use management question. So this segment of river, the ORVs are recreation, motorized and non-motorized boating are a component of the recreation ORV, scenery and wildlife. The tentative classification is scenic on the South Fork of the Snake River in Idaho. Next slide. So the agency proposed action is to introduce motorized boating use restrictions in a section of river. The objective of the restrictions, the proposed restrictions on motorized boating, is to reduce conflicts between motorized and non-motorized recreation users within the segment of the river. And the river is eligible. Next slide. So here's some of the key questions that you might consider asking, and please feel free to come up with other key questions that you would ask. Would the restrictions include any limits on the total amount of visitor use, or would it impose any kind of timing restrictions on a certain class or group of users? Would implementing the restrictions require construction of additional launch site or additional takeout facilities? So thinking about kind of those indirect effects that might come later. What about wildlife? Any effects on wildlife? You'd certainly want to make sure that you consider that in the NEPA analysis. Next slide. Oh, let's go back on that one.
Yeah, I think that is the last one there.
Oh, is this the last slide for that one? Yeah, thanks, Angie. Yeah, so what do we think? Approve it? Go forward and do the analysis in your NEPA? Would this foreclose any ORVs, do you think? Yeah, so Monica, that's a great observation. Yeah, maybe depending on how the ORV is described for wildlife and which wildlife species are affected by motorized use, you may be enhancing the wildlife ORV and fish. Yeah, and also, you would hope that the proposed action also is benefiting all different groups of users, right? So it's helping to make the recreation experience for everybody better along the river. Sometimes working through these things can require a lot of collaboration with different user groups to kind of get there, to help you get through your NEPA process, and interact with the different constituencies who use and care about the river. Yeah, Alan, thanks. That's a really good observation there. Could you look at alternative restriction types? So for example, reducing the horsepower limits on the river, to kind of minimize those conflicts or noise conflicts. Or vessel size. Yeah, great. So one of the things that I noticed about this is that we aren't required to conduct user capacity on eligible and suitable rivers, right? So that's a Wild and Scenic Rivers Act thing. But you definitely, as you're going through kind of these sort of proposed actions or in your NEPA, you want to have an eye to those issues that are related to user capacity. So what is the visitor experience? What's the desired conditions that we're providing for visitor experiences? How many people, you sort of want to consider those things that you would do on a designated river when you did user capacity study. Okay, great. Great answers on that. Thanks, everyone. We'll go on to the next example. Okay, this one is a water resources project and hydropower projects. On this river, the ORVs are described as float boating and fishing, so recreation, scenery, geology, endangered and sensitive fish. The tentative classification of scenic, there's some occasional trails and roads and primary river access points that lead to irrigation facilities within the river corridor. And the river is suitable, 5D1 suitable. So here's a picture of the existing condition. There's a diversion dam on the river that is routinely constructed and maintained using a bulldozer, what we know is called as a push-up dam. So they bulldoze some gravel in order to pool up the water to get the water to flow down their irrigation ditch. So in this picture, you can see the river flows through a narrow channel on the far left-hand side of the photo, and then the irrigation ditch and the head gate itself is outside the picture there on the upper right side of the photo. Flows are channeled through a narrow passage at the far end of the dam, which also restricts boat and fish passage. This is a legacy practice that's considered allowable under state water rights law. So you have kind of like a valid existing use there, a valid right to divert water. Okay, next slide. So the agency proposed action on this one is to replace the diversion ditch, or the diversion dam, sorry, with an updated structure that improves boat and fish passage. And the agency is also going to remove the rock dam from the channel and install stream barb. And you can see that kind of there in the picture. So a submersible, under the surface stream barb that helps to channel the river toward the head gate and the irrigation ditch. Next slide. So some of the key questions that you'd want to ask here would be, how would the project affect free-flowing conditions? Did the previous structure impair the ORVs? And would the new structure actually improve conditions for ORVs? Or you might need to ask, will the classification itself be affected or downgraded by the proposal? And then lastly, do the procedural requirements of Section 7 apply to this project? What do you think? Any thoughts on this one?
I'm guessing everyone's just typing their response in. Monica asked, you said this was non-congressional, right?
Yeah, correct. Yep. Agency study river. Yep. Yeah, I think we're probably making some improvements here. So we're improving scenery. It appears like the project is going to improve free-flowing conditions, improves the condition of those ORVs, which include fish and recreation. Definitely improves the scenery. Yeah, Section 7 wouldn't apply, but you'd want to do some kind of analysis on free-flowing conditions. Yep. Yeah, great insight, Monica. Yeah, you always want to ask that question, are there other ways to accomplish the task that preserve those river values as much as possible? Some revegetation. erosion control structures. Yep. Great. Okay, next slide. So in closing on some examples as it relates to hydropower or water resources projects on eligible and suitable rivers, you want to be careful to recognize that it's not just projects that happen on the designated river itself, but you may need to look at protective management and effects to eligible suitable rivers from projects that are, say, on a tributary. So in this picture here, there's a picture of an irrigation headgate that could affect downstream flows that those ORVs depend on the quantity of water in the river. So sometimes a project may not actually be on the eligible or suitable segment itself that you'd want to make sure you take a look at in your NEPA analysis for the project. Great, next slide. And that about wraps it up for me. I'm going to hand it off to Tanji to go through a number of other examples. There'll be plenty of time at the end, I hope, for some conversation around these topics. And so I'm going to hand it off to Tanji.
Thanks, Kai. Yeah, everybody can do a little stretch. We've got a couple more examples. This isn't a clear dividing line, but some of the examples we have here are maybe less a focus on like infrastructure that's related to recreation or maybe like visitor use scenarios, and some that focus on ORVs like fish or vegetation and things like that. And then I'm also going to be covering a couple considerations about how the NEPA process plays a role in how we analyze these projects, and what role land management plans have in this discussion as well. So let's start with a fish-related project. So in this scenario, the ORVs established for this segment are fish, in this case, the preservation of native cutthroat trout. There's also a botanical ORV, as there's been hanging gardens from the springs identified in this segment. And our tentative classification is wild, which makes our ears perk up in regards to sort of activities related to how we access this section of the river and what we do in that space. So in this case, the proposed action is to install a temporary fish barrier to aid in the eradication of an invasive brook trout that's impacting our fish ORV negatively. And in this case, the construction access is going to require a temporary 2-track road. Well, I guess I put the word require in there, right? Let me take that word out. Does not require, but it's proposed. And next slide, here's some things that we can consider about this project. Can temporary structures be installed in an eligible or suitable stream segment in this case? Focusing on the word temporary. How will the construction and deconstruction of the barrier, because it's temporary, how would this affect the ORVs that have been established for this segment? What are some ways that we could mimic natural flow processes in the project design? Because in this case, if we're talking about a barrier, there are likely to be some type of impacts to the free-flowing character of this segment. Another question that we might ask is, does our agency allow new structures that can be highly visible? We can take a closer look at this photo and sort of observe the visual impact there. Although it was not mentioned that there is an officially designated scenic ORV, so that's something to think about as well. Would love to get some of your thoughts, and then we can walk through a few things about this scenario. Good question, Lisa, considering what the time frame for temporary is. Wonderful. Yeah, especially because we do need to sort of balance our consideration of this relative term of short term versus long term impacts to any given ORV. Yeah, thanks, Bud, for that contribution. Upon evaluating the current impacts to the fish ORV, is it possible that it could be lost, that ORV could be lost entirely without some form of intervention in this case? I think it's also important to consider, even as we try to, propose a project that's compatible with the river segment classification and ORVs. If you are to modify the project to that degree, is the project still going to accomplish the original goal of maintaining that fish ORV? And in some cases, as we mentioned in other examples, that can lead us to ask questions to trigger sort of a suitability discussion if we feel that maintaining a certain value needs to be done in such a way that cannot be compatible. But we had a couple other contributions on this one. Are there any other locations along the segment that have a more significant gradient where a man-made barrier would appear more natural as long as natural appearing materials are used, such as large boulders? Alan mentions, I'd want to know more about the temperature change in the impounded water and how that would impact the trout habitat. It's a good consideration. Also want to know about it possibly dividing up the breeding of the trout populations. Another recommendation of maybe a fish weir could be utilized that could be sort of packed in rather than constructing a temporary 2-track road while eliminating the need for heavy machinery and concrete structure. Yes, that's a great consideration to make for a wild segment. Becky mentions ESA could come into play. Wilderness Act, if this is located in a wilderness. Yeah, so a couple of the things that I'd like to mention about design components and what we consider to sort of be compatible with what the system of the river is the barrier itself, right? So we had a few things mentioning, does the barrier mimic any naturally occurring events in the segment, like trees falling in or across the river, like forming woody debris jams? Are there boulders that move around across the river segment? Is it normal to see the exposure of bedrock outcrops or any other things like that? But in addition to thinking about the barrier itself, we have to think about what the barrier could be impeding in regards to natural channel processes. So this could include natural processes like bank erosion, the formation of bars, channel migration. And it's also important to note that a lot of rivers transport sediment, woody debris, or even ice. And so we want to think both about, is it normal to have barriers and what does it look like? And if there are barriers, does it impede some of these other natural processes that are occurring in the river? I'll also mention and highlight that the Forest Service does have sort of a in-depth Q&A about this topic, fish barriers and free flow. And so there's a lot of great info in both of these. Okay, let's move to the next example. Okay, let's talk about vegetation management. In this case, this river segment has a geologic, hydrologic, and botanical ORVs identified. And it's also interesting to note that these plants depend on the unique geology and hydrology of the area. which includes a groundwater-fed stream system and really unique stream chemistry. And the tentative classification of this segment is wild. So again, we're thinking about access and development. The proposed action is to remove lodgepole pine in the stream corridor that have been killed by pine beetle. And it's important to think about the need and the purpose for this one, especially because that is called out in policy. And so in this case, we're talking about mitigating a safety hazard and also removing an extreme fire hazard, which is, you know, a priority in many cases. So let's talk about some of the questions that we might ask about the project. And I don't know if I mentioned, but I hope that you guys can see where the X's are, so we can also think about where the activity needs to occur in this case. But some of the questions we might ask would be, how would the trees be cut down and removed? What impact does tree removal have on ORVs in both the long term and the short term? How would the status of the ORVs change over the long term if the proposal is not implemented? So what do we think about a project like this, especially in consideration of the purposes? Thanks, Kai. Yeah, there does seem to be a lot of potential here with a good project plan. It's likely that a project like this wouldn't have negative impacts on the ORVs that were identified, some having to do with hydrologic processes in this case. And then, yeah, again, it's important to talk about so how we would access the site as well. So I'll also just highlight some vegetation specific language from the Forest Service manual in regards to wild segments. And so it says cutting of trees and other vegetation is not permitted except when needed in association with a primitive recreation experience to protect users, which we highlighted the safety aspect of this project. And other examples include activities to maintain trails, which was highlighted here, safety along those trails, and to suppress wildfires. And I see we've got a couple more thoughts to characterize this project. Yeah, Lee mentions a few, since the project is targeted, it seems like something we could execute pretty well. And but also mentions the connection between that chemistry, the unique chemistry in the area, and fire. Thanks. Yeah, let's go to the next project. All right, this is our last case study. So give me all you got, give me all your ideas. So in this case, we've got a segment that has ORVs of scenery. There's a fish ORV, which it says it's sensitive. We don't know to what, but it's sensitive. And there's a geologic ORV in the area as well. And in this case, we're working with a recreationally classified river. And there's a note that it's located near a state highway and some private ranches. Now, the proposed project here is to physically remove all the tamarisk that's been defoliated by the tamarisk beetle. So there's like a purple line. I hope you can see that as well, highlighting the area. This would involve a chemical treatment to treat the tamarisk sprouts. And part of the plan includes replanting bare soils with native seeds and native plant rootstock. So let's talk about considerations for this project. It would be really useful to check the land use plan to see if there are any provisions for invasive species control. So that's something that we could take a look at for this project. We could also talk about how the treatments would change the character of the river corridor. Would we have impacts to scenery? Would the chemical treatment, how far would that migrate? Would that affect water quality? And then we also ask ourselves, are we going to be able to achieve that benefit that we're looking for? So will the treatments enhance the ORVs over the long term? Right. Yeah, thanks, Kai. Definitely want to talk about the chemical treatment. And again, is that going to migrate and impact fish habitat, water quality, other resources? Good question, Susan. Is the chemical treatment the only option? Galen highlights tamarisk. Let's just do it. Alan mentions using aquatic safe herbicides. Could talk about erosion, right? Great note, Monica, because there's going to be a transition phase before we're able to revegetate the area. So we need to consider what impact that's going to have in the meantime. And these are some really great mitigation ideas, Kyle. Limit treatments and removal time to times of year outside of peak seed season. Use colored treatment as an indicator to recreational users. And yeah, it seems like with the right planning, in the short term, the vegetation treatment would probably negatively impact the scenery in the area. However, over the long term, the project is designed to restore native species to the river corridor, which does, in the end, benefit that scenic ORV. And vegetation treatments are allowed in segments classified as recreational. And again, considering practices that are designed to protect our users and protect and enhance our Wild and Scenic River values. Thanks, guys. Yeah, that was really nice. I feel like I learned from you guys as well as we move through each of the case studies. So let's make a little bit of a shift. This did come up in our case study examples before. We're going to talk a little bit about the NEPA process in these proposed actions. So just as a refresher, an environmental assessment is it's a planning document. It's an evaluative document. And so we're making considerations of being specific in regards to what action is being proposed, making a really thorough description of the environment where the action is proposed to take place. We're also talking about the alternatives, which you guys have done a good job of identifying alternatives to the action and then sort of analyzing outcomes based on that. And so from a protective management perspective with eligible and suitable rivers, the things that we're going to describe in the sections of our environmental assessment includes the status of eligibility and suitability, where the segment is located. As we mentioned, that classification comes into play. Also talking about ORVs and water quality. So when you get to the effects section, what we're going to do is do a thorough analysis on each of these aspects of the river corridor. So we're going to do an analysis on the free-flowing condition. We're going to talk specifically about impacts to classification, which again has to do with development level and access. And then we're going to be able to work through each of the highlighted ORVs, which it was noted earlier, it's so important that we have well-described ORVs when it comes to these assessments, so that we can really get into the details and just weigh the pros and cons. And then, of course, coming back to impacts to water quality. So we've got some examples that we can share. And so the emphasis here is that the rationale needs to be very explicit. And so we're sort of, there shouldn't be like sort of gray area about like, what was that good or bad? It should be pretty explicit, and we should talk about the aspect of the value that is being impacted. So in this case, some language that we could use to describe impacts to free-flowing condition. An example would be a proposed whitewater park is approved because it will not impound water or significantly modify the banks of the Stony River. So it's talking about what it will or won't do in regards to the free-flowing nature of the river here. And impoundment is a word that's, comes directly from the act itself in regards to free-flowing nature. So if we wanted to discuss classification, an example would be talking about, in the case of a proposed extension of a county road for 3 miles adjacent to Beaver Creek, could be denied because the construction would modify the classification of the creek from scenic to recreational. Right, because the recreational classification includes segments that have rivers that or that have roads that run directly next to the river corridor. Another example for an ORV, the proposed capacity increase to the Garvin Mesa electric transmission line is approved because the applicant has agreed to bury the new line within the river corridor, avoiding impacts to the scenic ORV. So we can mention mitigations. And another example regarding water quality, a proposed fire mitigation and fuels reduction project along Troublesome Creek is approved because the project design and mitigation measures avoid permanent increase in sediment loads to the creek. I think this one could probably maybe be improved a little bit, just maybe talking about short-term versus long-terms, and that's it's important to sort of reason through that. Maybe like it's not always fair to make the assumption that long-term improvement equates to like zero impact, and so it's important to see how we weighed the short-term and long-term together. I mean, each of these could probably use a little bit of bolstering, and it's really just about including the best rationale that we possibly could. So overall, we can be guided by our agency policy, and it allows us to only approve NEPA document if it demonstrates compliance with that policy. So it's so important that we refer to our respective agency policy. And in cases where it's an interagency effort, we've got to do that coordination and sort of compare any differences in policy as well. But it's got to be compatible. All right, let's talk a little bit about impacts to the land use plan, basically how the land use plan comes into play. And so we need to make sure that our land use plans reflect sort of this unique status of eligible and suitable rivers, and what protective management means, and make sure that it's described in that case. So the key aspect here in our land use plans is to have developed some kind of monitoring strategy, because that's really what gives this protection a tangible rationale to help us bolster our understanding of what impacts are occurring and sort of how those ORVs are trending as well. Because if we're not sort of like actively pursuing the enhancement of those ORVs, we do sort of need to see how they're trending under current conditions. And so that's the consideration that we include in our land management plans as an effective monitoring strategy. So here are some other considerations that we can include for management direction in our land use plans. So in this case, there are some stipulations about surface occupancy and the control of surface use. We touched a little bit on right of way. We talked about establishing clear criteria for the protection of fish, wildlife, and vegetation. It's great to call out and develop specific restoration and enhancement projects. And then in addition to that, we also discussed visitor use and how that might sort of inform management goals and desired conditions for the area. And then, of course, applying any guidance related to mineral withdrawals. So there's a lot of tools that can help to inform how we evaluate these projects as well that should be included in the land use plan and referenced from the land use plan. So we talked about monitoring earlier and how important that is to help us really have an effective evaluation of project proposals. And so in this case, of course, monitoring, the hope is that we extrapolate data that is going to help us answer this question: are the river values effectively being maintained? And so making sure that we have data that's consistent, things that limit sort of confounding factors and variables, because it's always frustrating when you have a lot of data, but you can't really tell any story with it. And so those are some important considerations for our monitoring strategy. And then, of course, like the way we actually go about implementing that monitoring needs to conform with guidance from agency policy. All right, so in summary, it was really great to hear a lot of the considerations that came into play. Really what we're teaching is a strategy, it's a mindset, right? Asking the right questions and asking the breadth of questions that can help us inform protective management to the best of our ability. And so really it starts with what we understand and wrestle with, the values and intent of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act itself. We take a look at explicit description of law and regulation. We refer to our manuals, our land use plans. We use monitoring to inform our understanding of the values we're trying to protect and enhance. And then we talk about how we can have good project design, and then overall the daily management of those segments in general, right? So from here, let's open up the questions. I know the chat has been kind of active. I didn't catch everything in there. So I'll open it up to Angie to sort of facilitate some of our extra questions here. And I invite you guys to, come on camera, come on the mic too, if you want to, talk amongst one another. And then Kai, of course, appreciate your input on some of the questions we've got in here as well. But yeah, thanks so much, guys.
Thanks, Angie. And yeah, I'm looking back at some questions and maybe Kai, did you want to touch on a little bit? At least I saw that you put a short answer to Kyle's question about the nationwide rivers inventory.
Yeah, you bet. Yeah, so Kyle brought up the analysis requirements if your segment is also listed on the nationwide rivers inventory. And just real quickly on that, the nationwide rivers inventory is managed and maintained by the National Park Service. And it relates to a presidential memo going back into the late 1970s from President Carter that says that those rivers are to be protected from any adverse effects to those rivers, and all federal agencies have to consider their effects to NRI rivers. So this is the Nationwide Rivers Inventory is in partial fulfillment of Section 5D1 of the Act. So it is that list of the remaining free-flowing rivers in the United States that may have or potentially have outstandingly remarkable values, or that have the conditions of eligibility. So free-flowing condition, ORV, and a classification. And those rivers have some interim protections until the agency has completed their studies on them. So that's kind of like a third consideration to thinking through your process for reviewing and approving projects on eligible and suitable rivers.
And then a quick follow-up, I saw Brian ask, so if a river is in the NRI, but a suitability determination has been made to not protect those rivers, then we don't need to consider or disclose further, correct?
Oh boy, yeah, Kyle, that's a complicated question. It's the hot question. I would say that you should disclose it, including if there's a conflict between, say, the NRI and the determination in the agency study. Just disclose that there's a conflict. It would probably be at least a good starting approach to that.
Yeah, document. I also saw a question from Orion that asked, do land use plans ever have explicit provisions to allow fisheries projects, etc., that might impact the free-flowing conditions? If ORVs are improved, or is this just tackled through NEPA process?
I'd have to check on examples. I mean, it's come up like in eligibility studies, in a few forest land management plan revision processes over the past few years. I can't remember if they settled on explicit provisions like that, but I think most of the time we really wanted to see individual analysis, because the suitability process can play a really key role in sort of like the holistic management of river segments where there's ongoing conversations about fish conservation and free-flowing conditions in eligible river segments. So I haven't seen it like encouraged, and I would have to check if there's anything that got through as like an explicit provision for those activities.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in and I noted a question from Becky Blanchard in the chat. And just a comment on that, Becky. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, one of the hardest parts can be figuring out which rivers are eligible and suitable, right? And so some of our land management plans maybe go back into, say, even the 1980s or before, during a time where maybe we didn't do these studies as thoroughly as we do them today in land management planning. And so you may have to go back 2 or 3 versions of your land management plan to even sort of figure out which eligibles are, or which rivers are eligible or suitable, or what their ORVs are. That can be one of the challenges in kind of doing analysis for these things. A lot of times, perhaps you might encounter that the ORVs weren't very well described or described at all. It might just say scenery. And so that can make an effects analysis for proposal pretty challenging. A few ideas on that would be to, you go back and do your research, right? Like try to find those old eligibility or suitability studies that are stuck in some file drawer somewhere. Maybe you can glean some insights into from other projects that might have been analyzed on that segment of river. Just a few ideas how to work through that.
And Lee, thanks for the addition in regards to the situation with the Gila River, and it having a consideration about a call out for fish barriers. But yeah, I'm not seeing it in a specific land management plan, so it's kind of a preference to go case by case rather than making that a solid provision for segments.
Yeah, hey Brian, I saw your question there, and yeah, it's a really good question. I think some of these things get often overlooked in NEPA. That's my experience with some of these projects. Generally, the existing condition would be is described as protective management. So as you're working through your alternatives, and you're describing your existing condition, you would disclose in the NEPA that it is under protective management, that the conditions are protected. And ideally, it depends on the project. It gets complicated here, depending on what the proposed action is. But your preferred alternative, ideally, would be to continue to conserve those river values, free-flowing condition, the ORV, and the river values, as part of your preferred alternative. It is what we're supposed to be doing, but you have to weigh that against the nature of the proposal. So, for example, is there valid existing rights? There's some overriding concern where the agency in its preferred alternative may say, our preferred alternative is to, possibly have adverse effects to the ORV. Not sure if that helped. I hope it did. It can get pretty complicated in NEPA, how we deal with eligibility and suitability at the project level. I think an important consideration is, what is the degree of adverse effects that you're having on the ORVs, the free flowing condition, and the classification. If you're really changing classification, extirpating an ORV, or extirpating free flowing condition, then I think we have a higher level of responsibility in that NEPA analysis to kind of disclose that and work through those issues. Whereas, as opposed to say, like, you're just going to have short-term effects to ORVs, or it's a temporary road or something like that, that might have short-term effects to classification versus those long-term effects that could really end up disclosing the ability of Congress to designate the river into the system.
Then I know we only have a couple more minutes, but maybe one of you can say something about baseline monitoring for protective management.
Oh yeah, I can jump in on that. Tanji, join me on this one as well. Yeah, so we are required. We should be doing monitoring and up against the baseline for our eligible and suitable rivers. You bet. Our whole management goal is to not have the conditions degrade in such a way that could potentially foreclose their designation. And Bud, you make a really good point there. A lot of time, baseline monitoring for eligible and suitable rivers, we don't have it. We have a hard enough time sometimes managing our designated rivers and having good baseline inventories, resource inventories for our designated rivers, let alone our eligible and suitable rivers.
Yeah, I guess the one thing I'll add to that, in that case, if there's like not really explicit data referring back to the criteria that was established for the ORVs would probably help inform you, because at some point it did meet the outlined criteria. And at least it's like a starting point, even if you don't maybe have explicit numbers. But yeah, the ORV criteria that was outlined during the original study, it's a good place to start if you don't have anything.
Yeah, and I'll add to that too as well. We could go for a long time on talking about these issues. So it's just such a fascinating topic. But a lot of times your other specialists in your office can be a real asset to you. Like, for example, on this question around baseline studies, there may have been, say, a watershed assessment that included that river. And so you can kind of glean existing conditions, baseline conditions of resources from other studies that are available in your office and from your specialists, like your hydrologists or your fish biologists. They're great people to lean on for some of these questions.
Well, thank you both so much. This has been an awesome session and just a quick reminder, I will be sending this out. You can find it on the YouTube channel as well. I also included, we have a Wild and Scenic River playlist on the RMS YouTube channel where you can check out previous sessions from this series as well as sessions from the last 3 years worth of series and anything else that we've done Wild and Scenic related. And I also just want to remind you that we'll be back again on May 15th, same time. We'll be looking at some climate change and climate adaptation and mitigation strategies for wild and scenic rivers and really all rivers, but trying to focus in on some wild and scenic river examples. So hope to see you there. And there should be a short survey that pops up on your screen when you end the Zoom session. Would love to hear your thoughts. And if this topic interests you, today's topic on protective management for eligible and suitable rivers, feel free to let me know. You know, maybe this is something that we put together a more extended session or like a little short course on, because I know it's hard to cover so much in just 90 minutes. But thanks to Tanji and Kai again. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their Wednesday.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you.
Bye now.